Welcome to the Fire These Times, a podcast dedicated to the easy task of tackling the 21st century from the periphery. This podcast is ad-free and accessible to everyone thanks to the generous donations of Patreon supporters on patreon.com/firethesetimes. For as little as $5 a month or $50 a year, you can help keep this podcast independent that way. The Fire These Times is named after the James Baldwin book The Fire Next Time, and the music is by Ibrahim Youssef. Thank you for listening and take care. Hey everyone, so this is a conversation with William C. Anderson. He is the author of the book The Nation on No Map, and he's also the co-author of the book As Black as Resistance, both of which came out with AK Press in 2021 and 2018 respectively. He is also the co-founder of Offshoot Journal, and he provides creative direction as a producer on the Black Autonomy Podcast. So we primarily spoke about his book The Nation on No Map. So this was kind of like a long conversation on Black Anarchism, the influence of Zen Buddhism, seeing the world as a janitor, critiques of Black nationalism, capitalism, and liberalism. It's about so many things that I'm not even gonna try and summarize. You can just check out the summary below if you want in the description. I will just say, and then I will shut up, that as with all of these episodes, I hope you don't get kind of like intimidated or what have you by the titles. So for example, in this specific case, if you're not an anarchist or you don't identify as one, it doesn't matter. It really does not matter. And we actually talk about this specific thing in the episode itself, how the labels don't matter as much. The framework is just something that we both find useful, depending on how it is used, obviously. And in the end, this is a really fascinating conversation. I recorded it a couple of months ago, more or less, but I had to postpone it because of like Ukraine-related stuff that I've also been doing. And I'm very excited to be releasing it now. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to share it with your friends, with your family, with your enemies, and what have you. And as always, thank you for listening.
My name is William C. Anderson. I'm a writer from Birmingham, Alabama, and I started writing when I was encountering a lot of issues as an organizer that I wanted to share my feelings about. So I've been writing and doing all sorts of movement work at the same time for a while now, and I'm still learning a lot and doing my best to try to put my thoughts together when I have something that I think is worth sharing. So that's just a little bit about me.
Thanks a lot for being here. We'll be primarily talking about your latest book, which is called The Nation on No Map, Black Anarchism and Abolition. And you've written other books, feel free to bring them up as well. Can we start with, as I usually do, with you just talking a bit about the book, like what is it about, how did it come about, that sort of thing?
Yeah. So the Nation on No Map is a continuation from the line of thinking that I've been going down for quite a while now, for I guess really almost the last 10 years of my life. It's many things. It's a warning to a lot of young radicals or people who are new to left movements, and it's also a shedding and really me getting some things off my chest and getting away from some stuff that I don't want to get caught up in. I guess more generally, it's a rejection of the state as a solution to the problems facing Black America. And this book is working against the idea that the formation or reform of the state is necessary as a practical political goal. So, on the traditional Orthodox left, the predominant solution to most things is based in nationalism, statism, and a desire to seize or abolish state power in order to have what some feel is an appropriate version of state power or a reformed version, a quote unquote revolutionary state. Um, I'm using Black anarchism to look at these conflicts as it relates to abolition, immigration, Black history, nationalism, and the left. And that's really that really sums up what this book is about.
I mean, I know you might think I say this to all guests, but this is this is truly a fantastic book. Um, you wrote in it, I think, in the beginning that like by the time you finished writing it, you were a new person. Can you kind of talk about that a bit?
Yeah, that goes back to the aspect of what I was talking about when I said it was shedding. It was it was a process where I was letting go of a lot of different things about, what we call the left, which is something that I think doesn't actually really exist in the way that many people imagine it. But it's also something that encompasses a lot of different factions that disagree and have a lot of issues with one another. Um, so, it's bigger than that, though. It's also me addressing some of the things that I thought about nationhood and nationalism, and things that I felt about, Black history, things that I was raised, and things that I thought for the majority of my life. I'm calling a lot of those things into question, and I wrote in a kind of summary of the book that it's a text that is informed by the iconoclasm of Zen. And what I mean when I say that is that when you look at a lot of the early Zen texts and Zen Buddhist monks, they're pushing against doctrine and dogma in a way that is such a ruthless self reflection and self criticism that it becomes apparent that they're actually working to overcome themselves and the very idea of what has been established as this kind of doctrinaire approach to Buddhism. I think that I'm kind of doing the same thing in some ways with all of those things that I just mentioned, with Black history, with nationalism, with leftism, all of it. I'm trying to encourage other radicals to push for more and to push for something greater by admitting the shortcomings and the failures in history rather than just glorifying it and pretending that everything has gone right. We have to look at the limitations.
Mm. As it happens, we're recording this end of January, and I don't remember, a week or two ago, Thich Nhat Hanh, the famous Buddhist monk and thinker, died. I will try and channel him a bit in this conversation because I read a lot of his books, I would say about a decade ago. Um, but yeah, just wanted to put it out there. And at the beginning of your book, you mention how, as a janitor, and yeah, I'm gonna quote you if that's okay. As a janitor, you learn intimately what's wrong with the society because you have to clean it up. You get to know society very well through its messes. How much someone despises you or fails to see you is apparent in what they leave behind for you to clean up. I repeatedly met capitalism and white supremacy with a mop in my hand and often wished it was a blade instead. End quote. When I read this, and obviously this is a podcast that the title is named after the one of James Baldwin's books, The Fire Next Time. One thing that is, it's an insight that I kind of took to heart, you might say, and very much still is with me like in a lot of the things that I do. He has this, well, he has it in writing as well, but there's this clip on YouTube, which I will find and put in the description, where he was talking to some interviewer who I think is white, based on what James Baldwin said, because Baldwin said something along the lines that I am not the N word, and but this is not me essentially. But what the fact that white people created that N-word means that they have to be the ones to figure out why they did so. And so the way he framed it is that I throw back this problem at you. You're the ones who invented it. You're the ones who have to deal with that category. And I sort of got a bit of that sense, and please correct me if I'm completely off the rails here, but I got a bit of that sense while reading that paragraph specifically, because quite literally, of course, as a janitor, you're cleaning up the world's mess, the society's mess, but at the same time doing so, you also get to see, especially if you're thinking about it in that way, what it is that society wants to hide, what it is that society wants to render invisible, and through that, you get to actually understand society in ways that society, and here I'm using society as kind of a vague category, tends not to want to see. Basically, you end up understanding society better than society understands itself. And this is why I thought of Baldwin, because he always had this thing that the oppressed understands the oppressor better than the oppressor understands themselves, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah. That is definitely there. That's definitely there. I'm glad that you tapped into that. You do get an intimate understanding of your oppressors being a Black person doing janitorial work. And I've spent the majority of my life doing janitorial work. I grew up working class without many guarantees in terms of family income, and with both of my parents doing that sort of janitorial work. They both did it. So I learned I had to work from a very early age. I really started working and helping my family clean when I was tiny. I was maybe 7 or 8 years old or something like that. So cleaning made me have to grow up fast. And my father also did carpentry work that I helped with on the side too. So, I spent a lot of time with day laborers and undocumented immigrants and people who were also dealing with all sorts of various oppressions that you experience in under those circumstances too. So, I had to work nights after school with my family and on the weekends too. And it was really hard. And doing that work as a Black person in the South gives you an intimate understanding of the legacy of slavery, labor exploitation, and subjugation. You know, Cleaning up after white people taught me very quickly what white people thought of me. I saw their, theft. I saw abuses. I saw advances, and disregard just made very plain. And so there were a lot of times I saw and experienced, horrific and oppressive things that made me so mad that I wanted to get violent. And, people treat you like dirt and like you are a piece of trash because you take out the trash. So, I have stories for days about every kind of abuse you can imagine. And I was doing this from my childhood, uh, and it's worsened by the fact that, you're doing it in a conservative, right wing, Christian fundamentalist place that romanticizes and longs for chattel slavery. So, you can imagine everything that one could experience in those conditions.
We'll definitely talk, especially about that legacy of slavery. But before that, there are a number of names that you mentioned in the book, and two of them are actually, one of them wrote the foreword and the other one wrote the afterwards, so clearly you know them very well. But can you talk to us a bit about folks like Saidiya Hartman, Lorenzo Comboa Irvin? Those are the two that I just mentioned, but also folks like Lucy Parsons, Kwasi Balagoon, feel free to mention others as well. Kind of how they've influenced your thinking in reaching the sort of conclusions that you've reached in the book.
Yeah, I'm really fascinated by Lucy Parsons. I find her
Mm.
particularly inspiring as a radical who was so confrontational at a time when things were very different. Her labor organizing history and the organizing work, and even her fashion sense, like
Mm.
all of it intrigues me. Her writings and her speeches are, in my opinion, horribly underappreciated. I think she's definitely been a huge influence on my thinking, especially with regard to electoralism and the pitfalls of liberalism and reform. Um, Lorenzo Camboa Irvin is foundational to contemporary Black anarchism, and obviously, I'm looking at things through the lens of Black anarchism in this text. So his work influenced me after I met him and Janina Irvin, who is the last editor of the Black Panther Party newspaper and an anarchist herself. I met them in my early 20s. Um, and, Lorenzo's book, Anarchism and the Black Revolution, which is recently republished by Pluto Press, everybody go pick it up. It changed my whole way of seeing the left. Um, he kind of takes a blowtorch to conventional orthodox leftism, and he says a lot of things that are extremely controversial because he just lays out the conventional left and the statist left, and said he calls it all into question, and he just kind of is just smashing orthodoxy and questioning it all um, in a really really needed way. And his bluntness is something that inspires me very deeply. And as far as like someone like Kwesi Balagoon, also brings a special bluntness in his own right that I find amazing. And he wrote with a flexibility that I admire, and his New African perspective. He was a New African anarchist. Um, he he frames a lot of my thinking too around statelessness and anti-imperialism and more, and also the ways that he thinks about anarchism in a really digestible and approachable way. Um, yeah, and Sadia's work is pivotal, is absolutely dynamic in Black studies. It's it speaks for itself, really. I think so many people know Sadia's work and how important it is to Black studies, and she's thinking about anarchism in ways that I feel um, align with a lot of the ways that I've been thinking about anarchism as well, and that was why I asked her to write the foreword, because I think that there was um, some shared some shared ideas there for sure. And so I try to make some of those comparisons in the text. And yeah, those are all people who are very influential to me and very special to me, and that I cherish for teaching me a lot of things that I'm still processing and still learning and growing with.
Just quickly on Lucy Parsons. Recently, I had a friend over about a month ago, and that friend, well, she had heard of and that friend identifies as a radical and everything, but she had heard of Lucy Parsons, but she had no idea that Lucy Parsons was black. She actually assumed that she was white,
Mm,
and this sort of brings me. I was gonna ask it a bit later, but I'll do it now since it's a good segue. That obviously you're talking about black anarchism, and the sort of the B is capitalized and the A isn't. You make a very convincing argument as to the difference between what we call black anarchism and what we might otherwise call classical anarchism, which is largely European anarchism. Can you sort of make that distinction for us, and why in the end you still felt that it was important to use the term black anarchism?
Yeah. So I think that, one of the most important things that I'm trying to point out is that, you know, Black anarchism is a movement that is distinct. And contemporary Black anarchism is a Black movement that finds its early beginnings with Lorenzo Cambor Urban writing Anarchism and the Black Revolution after Martin Sostre, a famous political prisoner at the time, introduced it to him about a decade earlier. So that's a really, pivotal text that underscored this, you know, movement coming into being of people from Black Power and civil rights movements toward anarchism. You had people like Ojori Lutelo, Kwesi Balagoon, Ashanti Alston, and others who rejected um, the vanguardism, hierarchy, and so on that they'd encountered in the civil rights and Black Power movements. And these former Panthers and members of the Black Liberation Army who developed this critique of the doctrines of Maoism, Stalinism, and Marxist Leninism, based on issues that they identified with them in movements, they their departure creates a breakaway movement that draws from what informed it, but it also critiques it, all of the above. It addresses the shortcomings of the ideologies it breaks from, but it also does that with classical anarchism too. And that to me is where its greatest potential lies, because it doesn't just say so simply, we're going to go from one side of the, binary to the other. It also critiques where it ends up. And so it's Black anarchism is definitely anarchism, but it also exceeds and works against the anarchist canon and doesn't necessarily seek inclusion in it. It actually, in my opinion, uh, gets closer than any other ideology that I found to actually exceeding the left, and that's what underscores so much of this. It's not just about saying be a Black anarchist or embrace Black anarchism, as much as it's saying look at the truth of what Black anarchism does. Look at this contribution that it shows us, um, that it gives us, this contribution that it gives us, to pushing for something more and for transcending these binaries and these boxes that people are trapped in and can't seem to escape because of uh, limitations.
Yeah, I think you said this elsewhere that, and correct me if I'm wrong, that the word anarchism isn't something that you necessarily go towards, but isn't something that you escape from either, or something along those lines.
Yeah, I was. That's been coming up a lot. It's something that I got from Modibo Kadali, who was a a dear friend and a very influential person and teacher in my life. Modibo Kadali, he gets called an anarchist, and he's not an anarchist. He doesn't claim that as an ideological label. He says a lot of things that are anarchist friendly, but he doesn't go around saying I'm an anarchist. And so one time when we were talking about that, because we talk pretty regularly at this point, I was asking him about it, and he said to me, I don't. He said I'm not an anarchist, but he said I don't run from it, but I don't run to it. And I thought that was really cool when he said that. And so I kind of took it as my own way of describing myself, because ultimately, um, you know, if someone describes me as a Black anarchist, I'm not going to say, no, I'm not. If somebody says that I am a communist, I'm not going to say, no, I'm not. Um, just because I don't necessarily feel tethered or tied to those labels. But that also doesn't mean that those things don't accurately describe my politics. My politics absolutely um, encompass, and contain Black anarchism as well as communism. Um, but I think the thing that I'm trying to say here is that oftentimes what happens with ideology is that people bring a religiousness to it and they get trapped by it, and then they can't exceed it and they can't admit failures and they can't overcome it because it becomes more about preserving the ideology than it is about actually using the principles and the truth of an ideology to achieve liberation. And that's what you see with so many people and movements. They're much more interested in preserving the doctrine and having a religious, overzealous approach to actually upholding and preserving the doctrine rather than doing what the doctrine is supposed to be achieving, which is, bringing about liberation and new freedom and a new world. People get so caught up in the dogma that they lose sight of that.
Yeah. Someone made me think of something that David Graeber would say, and I kind of knew him, and we were on good terms and stuff. And although we don't share all of our politics, but there was something he said something along the lines of like anarchism is a verb for him. It's something to do rather than something to be. And I suppose it's something along those similar lines of actually focusing on what is it that it is supposed to achieve, what do we mean by freedom, what do we mean by liberation, what do we mean by changing society, and actually taking the steps towards making that a reality, or at least making it a bit more of a reality,
Yeah,
rather than using all of those things as labels that we just attach to ourselves and sort of use it as more of a, I forgot who said this, but like kind of like as a blanket, as a security blanket, or as a badge to put on ourselves to kind of compare ourselves to others rather than making it, useful in any way.
absolutely. And that goes back to the Zen aspect of the text. Like, I don't talk about Zen at length in the text. I just kind of mention it in passing. But Zen has been influential in that way because, I think about these these early Zen texts where you have monks writing saying, I'm trying to destroy Zen doctrine. I'm trying to um,
Kill the Buddha.
exactly, Lin Chi, and you have to actually work to be critical and thoughtful about everything that you embrace if you're going to actually make progress. Because if you start just becoming so attached to ideology and getting stuck in it, then you're not going to be able to admit failures and shortcomings. And that's what you see with so much of the left. It's so caught up in just actually having these really, really silly ideological squabbles. And I've never um, wanted this book to be something that contributes to that. So I'm trying to make that clear. Anybody that reads this book and thinks that it's simply about saying anarchism is good, it's so much deeper than that. It's not just saying be an anarchist, be a black anarchist. Anybody that tries to render it that, or make it that, didn't really see what I was saying, or they didn't understand what I was saying, or they didn't read the book, because it's actually pushing for something much greater than anything that we know or that we have the language for. You can't just say that any ideology has figured everything out, because if these ideologies had already figured everything out, maybe we'd be free already.
So there's a lot there. I want to get into the issues with the left and thinking about the left, but before that, we don't often hear, I think I might be wrong, but we don't often think of thinking about anarchism and looking at the contributions of Zen Buddhism. How did that come about for you? How did you start thinking about Zen Buddhism?
I started thinking about Zen Buddhism because um, I was on a journey um, when I was younger, when I was a teen, and I was looking at different, you know, spiritual practices and faiths and so on and so forth. And I found myself doing a lot of study, and I ended up becoming really fascinated by Buddhism because Buddhism actually was one of the first places that I encountered um, that I encountered writings that were saying question me, that were saying, critique me, in terms of monks and figures that were, influential in Buddhism, including the Buddha. Um, and so reading reading those different monks that were saying question everything that I'm saying, don't just, believe it, actually intrigued me because I found that so rare to come across anything with regard to religion that was saying don't just have absolute faith and just go based on that, but actually question what I'm saying and, put it to the test. And so that kind of pulled me in. And I started out uh, really kind of being engulfed in Tibetan Buddhism for quite some time. And then I started kind of encountering dogma, and I started encountering a sort of religious practice along the way that led me to look a little bit more in different places. And I arrived at Zen, and Thich Nhat Hanh actually was someone who I was reading a lot at that time to really open my mind to considering what Zen was saying. And then I started reading beyond Thich Nhat Hanh and reading other monks, and I ultimately came to a place where I started to understand what Zen was saying, much more in terms of understanding our own nature and having that be something that can be transformative rather than just being attached to practice in certain forms.
This is, I don't know if you saw, I was smiling a bit just because I went through a very, very similar phase. I was, I mean, I remember even saying convert. Like I became a Buddhist when I was about 16. Um,
Yeah,
and I
yeah, that was around the
first,
same time as me when when I started reading.
and it was first like also Tibetan Buddhism. Like, I read a lot of Dalai Lama stuff, and then I moved to Thich Nhat Hanh. I think actually the same timeline, and I don't. It's kind of one of those funny things because I never became not Buddhist. I just don't use the term anymore, which is kind of a
Hmm.
very Zen thing, funnily enough.
Yeah,
Um, but yeah, it. I did use the term for some time, and it was a way I would identify myself and find others like me online back when Facebook was young, I would say, and that was still a thing. Um, but eventually, yeah, I just stopped using it. But I never not became it. I never became. It's still part of the sensitivity, you might say. It's still part of some of the framework in many ways, like trying to focus on the essence instead of the form. That sort of thing.
exactly. And
Um,
you so you see what I'm saying about how it just
yeah,
parallels so much with anarchism and the way that I'm
yeah,
thinking about
definitely.
anarchism, right? Yeah.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, and it's a good. It's the way I'm thinking about it, and just thinking out loud now. It's a good way of softening some of the tendencies that we might see when someone identifies a bit too much, if that makes sense, with the word anarchism rather than with the practice or with the challenging, all of that stuff, like focusing on the form rather than the essence, to use that terminology again.
Right.
A lot of people on the internet could use that, I think.
Right. Absolutely.
So yeah, as I said, I do want to get into the left, but before that, I'm kind of postponing it a bit. But um, it like the this book is very contextual as well, and so there's a couple of things I want us to do, if that's okay. First, you mentioned Saidiya Hartman, and she has this sentence that I wrote here, like talking about the afterlives of slavery, and Du Bois saying, and this is his quote: "The slave went free, stood a brief moment in the sun, then moved back again towards slavery." Talking about Black Reconstruction in America. I don't know the exact percentage of where listeners are from. I don't have that entire data, but from what I can tell, most aren't from the US. I'm not entirely sure, but I think most aren't from the US. Can you sort of contextualize this a bit? And I'm not asking you to kind of redo the entire book. People can just get it, and I do encourage them to get it. But what is it about Reconstruction, if we want to focus on that, that tends to be overlooked or just not thought about in ways that are more critical, the way W.E. Du Bois does, that could be missed, not just in the US but also in the non-American audience? And the reason why I'm asking that is that if if a non and here I'm I'm placing myself as a representative of non-Americans, which is ridiculous, but um, there are these headlines, right? Like most people, because America is a superpower, is an empire, most people know sort of the headlines about the United States history. They sort of know the founding, quote unquote. They've heard of George Washington. They know some of the other names, Lincoln, etc., etc. They would know about the Civil War. Of course, they would know about slavery. And most people would also know about Jim Crow and the Civil Rights Movement and all of that. And some people, I think less than most people, if I have this right, would have heard about Reconstruction, but maybe not more than that. Like maybe not the details, or maybe why it sounds good, right? Like it sounds, you say Reconstruction, that sounds like a good thing. What was it? What is it about that period that still lives with us today? Like what was its legacy, and how did you sort of also start thinking about it?
Yeah. I mean, the Reconstruction era was a period uh, following the Civil War where racial inequalities were supposed to be addressed. And the defeated, and I say defeated in quotes, really, Confederacy was supposed to submit to new forms of integration and kind of burgeoning kind of Black institutions. And, this was a time where things changed for better and for worse for Black people in many ways. So while you had Black people experiencing new gains, you also had a building white resentment that became very deadly. So the institution of slavery was reshaped into things like um, debt peonage and convict leasing and the prison system as we know it now. So that's where the Du Bois quote hits really hard. I bring up Reconstruction because I'm trying to highlight how one version of oppression can take new shape and be given new life when the state uses its authoritarianism to reconfigure and adapt to social changes. So I think some folks believe for sure that we can cut off one tentacle of this monster and then we'll be better off. I wanted to show a place historically where that happened. And the tentacle grew back with new shape and with different reach.
Yeah, that's I think one of the best contributions in that book, and that's kind of the link to abolitionism and to abolition.
Yeah.
Uh, Recently, from what I understand, there's been a growing appreciation of the link between, for example, the police and the prison system, and that legacy of slavery. A lot more people, anyway, I would say, since the advent of Black Lives Matter, and especially since well, I was going to say last year, but Jesus, that was 2 years ago, 2020,
Mm-hmm.
the protests back then after the murder of George Floyd and others, of course. Um, I've heard, and I say this just as someone who listens to a lot of podcasts, and many of them tend to be American, and I see kind of the discourse online, and so it's not a perfect representation, but it's kind of a sense that I got that a lot more people know that there is this direct link. I actually forgot what they were called, but like one of the precedents to the police. But they were like sheriffs who would catch runaway slaves or something like that.
The Ku Klux Klan.
Yeah, it's them, and I think they were working with the police at the same time anyway.
Mm-hmm.
But there was this whole policy in certain parts of the U.S. where like their entire point, most of what they were doing was just catch people who were enslaved folks who were trying to flee for their lives or go elsewhere or cross state lines or that sort of thing.
Right.
But anyway, putting that aside, so thanks for that. That's actually very useful. And the next kind of segues to what I wanted to ask about this tension between, I'm gonna just use them in quotations, like reform and revolution, uh, which is a very complicated thing. And I admit, even for me, it's still something that's very difficult. I'm someone who, I'm doing okay. I don't have any existential threats or anything like that. But I'm also like a migrant in Europe, a non-white migrant in Europe, and an Arab at that. And there are lots of stuff that are still make me very worried and very afraid for sure. And that's why I do understand, although I don't subscribe to it myself, but I do understand the tendency to seek reforms, to seek what you call like relative improvements, and that's understanding it doesn't mean that I necessarily accept it as its kind of final goal, but I empathize with people who have that tendency, and that's how I try to talk to them. And I feel like people who have that fear of, let me give you a concrete example. Like if I am afraid of the far right in Europe, which I am,
Mm-hmm.
the EU can look like a relative improvement, right? Like compared to the far right.
Mm-hmm.
And the fact that the far right is capturing part of the EU worries me, even though I have very fundamental disagreements with the EU itself, even like as a foundation. I do think of it as tied to white supremacy, for example. I don't think it's possible to deny that. It's just not manifested in the same way, at least in the same overt way as what we were calling the far right and fascists. And that ends up being what I'm sort of forced to choose from, something that I don't like or something that I'm actively terrified by. You have this great quote, and I'm going to read it again if that's okay.
Mm-hmm.
We must be able to distinguish between relative improvements and actually achieving liberation. This isn't a dismissal of any past victories. Instead, it's an acknowledgement of the work that needs to be done given the ongoing disaster we're living in that is not being reformed away. And end quote. And I should say, I do appreciate the whole this isn't a dismissal of past victories, because there is a tendency on the left, and I feel like I'm just foreshadowing everything I'm gonna end up saying about the left, but there is a tendency on the left of dismissing those past victories, like
Yeah.
of dismissing Martin Luther King, Malcolm
Right.
X, James Baldwin, or just of dismissing everything. And I'll just name 3 well-known names, but others as well, obviously, as if the fact that they haven't achieved perfect revolution, quote unquote, whatever that means. I don't think anyone who uses that term actually knows what that means or what they mean by that or what that looks like or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
Means that nothing they say matters or nothing they have achieved matters. And I see this across the board. Like I see this from how protesters in Hong Kong were treated by those circles on the left online, especially, to how the Syrian revolution was treated and still is, to so many other examples that I'm probably spent too much time talking about. And this podcast, a lot of it is on that anyway.
Mm-hmm.
How do you deal with that? The relationship. I was gonna say tension, and maybe it is a tension, but the relationship between quote unquote reform and quote unquote revolution. How do you sort of approach it?
Yeah, I think, well, the first thing I'm thinking here is that sometimes we get consumed by this fantastical re envisioning of history that makes reforms into liberation. And I find that to be extremely dangerous. So, you know, disaster and, these issues look like many things, but among them is turning a gain or a victory into the totality of a fight. So you sit back in your chair and say, we did it when a problem is still there and oftentimes growing stronger. So you see this a lot with regard to Black history in the USA. The state actually has taken up Black history and absorbed it for its own purposes. It uses the civil rights movement and the legacy of someone like King to push this narrative that Black people have perfected US democracy and made it work when we're not even experiencing democracy. So, Black people live under the authoritarian threats of the state and its violence, carried out by murderous police and white supremacists. But if you think that a reform brought about liberation, then you can come to the conclusion that the movement is over and that freedom has been won. Now, what makes this even more complicated is that this also happens with regard to left politics, where you have different factions of the left who are looking at state socialist revolutions and saying that new governance and that new administrators of the state are liberation. And instead of looking at the larger picture that failures existed, that problems still exist, and that it's not over. You have to keep looking continuously at what's going wrong, and not just with regard to the domination and the oppression and exploitation of imperialism and what it's doing to state socialist projects, but also with regard to what's happening internally and what's happening inside of those projects and has happened inside of those projects to make things go wrong and to cause more problems. So you end up there with a different sort of question about reform, which is the reform of the state in a different context, in a state socialist context, and asking, okay, if we know that this is not over, if we know that things have not gone as well as they should have, then what needs to be done from here? What actually needs to be questioned? What needs to be reconsidered? These are a lot of the questions that come up for me with regard to reform and revolution, because they're connected in so many different ways. And a lot of the time I think that people don't actually realize that they're pushing for reform um, under revolutionary language. And so I'm trying to call a lot of that into question in this text, because I don't dismiss past victories and past gains that have come from, uh, places that I might depart from politically and ideologically. I don't dismiss them. I will give them give them credit where it's due. But what I am saying is that when you look at the truth of failure and the truth of shortcomings and the truth of corruption and problems of injustice and limitations. When you look at those things honestly, then you're able to actually develop further and push for something greater and push for something more, rather than get caught in this cycle of trying to preserve, mimic, and make the past into a completion and of a liberatory, um, no, a new liberatory condition. It's not. It's like saying, hey, let's actually be truthful about what did and didn't work, so we can push for something more, for something greater, rather than just pretending that everything has already been figured out.
For sure. I thought about. So I asked you this because I also thought of this book that I recently read. So I recently had Anna Malaika Tubbs, and she wrote this book called The Three Mothers, um, which is a story of Louise Litt. So the full title of the book is The Three Mothers: How the Mothers of MLK, Malcolm X, and James Baldwin Shaped the Nation. That's the title of the book. And that's episode 100 for those listening. It will be out by the time this episode is out. And there is this story, and okay, I'll just quickly say it. So the book is obviously on Louise Little, Malcolm X's mother, Alberta King, MLK's mother, and Bernice Baldwin, James Baldwin's mother. And I'll ask something about Louise later on, actually, because it's relevant to a different part of the book, which is the one on Marcus Garvey and the others. Um, but so in that book, in The Three Mothers, she tells of his story, and I was writing questions for her, but I actually thought of asking you um, a question. Sorry, I'm prefacing it wrong, but anyway, so that story, which is she mentions how the very idea of black people owning property, for example, was constantly under attack, often brutally by white people. There is the example of Atlanta, Georgia. This is one of the stories that she uses in the book. Sorry, when on September 22nd, 1906, black-owned businesses and private properties were destroyed by white supremacists who also murdered dozens of black people. It's described as a massacre. And I thought of Atlanta and I thought of Georgia because of this also, which is a separate story, but it's related to the question of the role of Georgia in defeating Donald Trump in the recent presidential election with the notable efforts of someone like Stacey Abrams. And so this is what I mean when I say that I don't have an answer when I'm put in a position, or if and I've had certain conversations with friends of like, well, okay, I do agree that electoralism isn't enough and it's part of the problem in many ways, and I would definitely agree with that. At the same time, and same with private property, same with the notion that all we need to do to be better at society is to be owners, right? Like to own businesses, to own property, to own etc. etc. With all the reservations I have, I also, as I said before, I do understand the tendency to think that way, because it has meant, and clearly, if it threatens white supremacists in the ways that we know, and we know to this day that the GOP, especially and other Americans like on the far right and stuff, are actively trying to disenfranchise Black Americans. We know this as a fact. And so, how do you, and maybe it's a bit of a repetition, so sorry about that, but how do you sort of think about what would you tell to people, let's say, who are thinking that way, that they may not disagree with what we're talking about, and they might say, okay, this is the ideal scenario, this is what ideally I would like the world to be this way, but we live in this world, and in this world, we need to think about A, B, and C, if you see what I mean.
Yeah, I mean, you know, um, with regard to the question of property and having ownership, that comes up in the text around kind of this black capitalist rationale. And, you know, um, I think that when we look at what happened uh, with in Tulsa with, what's called Black Wall Street, or what happened with regard to the move bombing, you begin to understand that Black capitalism's promises that accumulation will bring us freedom are not true, for many reasons. And I think that ultimately I'm trying to push back against that idea because my thinking about property is mostly influenced by the fact that I'm descended from people who were property.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
And that throws the whole idea of property into question once learn that about your ancestry, um, being descended from enslaved African people. The same way that people abuse the environment and extract from it, they've done as much with my ancestors. So it gives you a direct line to how capitalistic notions of ownership have to be disrupted and be pushed back and fought against to end up bringing about a better world because um, capitalism has created so much of this crisis and so much of this situation that we're in that thinking that it's going to be our way out is absolutely something that I'm against. And that's uh, that's how I feel about the state as well, and the appearance uh, of the state form with regard to the history of capitalism and accumulation, and trade, and the way that the ruling class is now positioned globally. So I think that there is a lot of parts of this book that are actually saying that, we have to call into question these various forms and these various ideas that we have been told are a way out of the predicament that we're in. And that happens across the spectrum. That happens with regard to liberalism, that happens with regard to the left, it happens with regard to nationalism, and so on and so forth. So, regardless of the fact that, this is the world we're living in, and this is the way that people do things in this way or that way, or in this group or in that group, the bigger question for me is, do you want this world as it is, or do you want something greater than this world? Because we're seeing the results of all of these things that I'm talking about and how they've manifested and how they've taken shape. If we want something new, then we have to ask new questions. We have to push for something new, and we have to think in ways that are new. We cannot just repeat and parrot the past and what we've been told in these various sections of, you know, the political spectrum.
No, thanks for that. I think that's a really good answer. And the the world as it is now, which obviously you describe as a disaster, and I would completely agree with that. One thing that I like to do from time to time on this podcast, and I try and imagine someone listening to this in, let's say, a decade or 2 decades. So, how would you describe this disaster to someone, let's say, in 10 years, in 20 years, and whatnot? Because and the reason I'm asking that is that we do have a tendency, and we all do it, it's a very human thing in many ways, to flatten the past complexities, right? Like we think of, well, to name an obvious example of the period when slavery was a thing in the US, in the sense of like the hundreds of years of child slavery and everything, as if that was the same period, right? Like there's a before and after that period, which tends to erase, or yeah, definitely tends to erase what enslaved people were doing in that period. It wasn't just a, passive what have you. There was active resistance. There was lots of people fleeing, lots of people, killing their enslavers or what have you. Um, and so that's sort of what I'm getting at. I'd like to think that this specific period, 2022, being listened next decade, let's say in the 2030s, given how this decade is most likely going to be, in the sense of, and here I'm using a very tactless term, eventful. Um, how would you describe this period we're going through?
Yeah, so I would say that I describe this period as capitalistic onslaught and a period where um, the world is in a state of ongoing um, environmental and ecological crisis. And what we see in terms of the state of this world and the state of this period is a strong need to start actually going in another direction. And a big part of that redirecting for me has to do with working against the priorities of the nation state form and what it does to fuel this capitalistic onslaught. And I mean that in terms of trade, in terms of migration, in terms of territory, borders, and the institutions that nation states rely on to preserve themselves, like prisons, policing, militaries, and so on and so forth. These things are driving many of the problems of this world. And regardless of what nation states may choose to call themselves or what their constitutions may offer in terms of promises and what citizenship might mean in different contexts, we know that there is definitely a global crisis. And for me, um, the war and the domination that has been inflicted on this planet by the state form, by imperialism, by capitalism, absolutely frames uh, the major problems of this era that we're in. So I don't know if that makes sense, but that's what I'm thinking about right now.
No, thanks for that. Um, yeah, as I said, it is something that it's always difficult, and you always wonder how this would sound like in 10 years, given how things are likely worse off in 10 years, hopefully not, but seems to be what the trend is going. But in any case, thanks for that. Um, Another thing I wanted to ask, and there's kind of like two questions that are, well, they're kind of the same question, or at least they're interrelated. So the first question would be on the legacy of the Black Panthers Party. How would you see that today? And the second question, which is intersected with that one, you argue in the book that a lot of I mean, its legacy is basically cosplayed rather than truly learned from. Can you sort of make that argument again, if that's okay?
Yeah, for sure. Um, I think that one of the things that comes up for me with regard to the Black Panther Party is that there are things that we should do that the Panthers were doing, but there were also things that occurred within the party that don't have to be repeated. So instead of just trying to copy what the Panthers did and said, we have to analyze what went right and what went wrong. And so the Panthers were not one thing. They were different. There were different chapters. There were different people. There were different leaders, and there were internal conflicts. But people reduced them to one thing and one ideology, which shows that we're not doing them justice in our study. So, in order to do justice to the Panthers and take their work further, we have to sit with the elders and see what they said about them, but also listen more closely to those who were overlooked for the sake of a glorified elite, the everyday women, children, and others whose testimony also matters to what was accomplished, gets lost in this kind of glorified tale of leadership that only remembers the famous Panthers, that only remembers the famous chapters, and the famous events. But there's a need for a complete historical uh, study of the Panthers, and a complete remembrance and a complete analysis of the different things that happened within the party and as a result of the party, as well as the departures, um, and different ways that people went off, such as, the folks who ended up creating the Black anarchist movement that I'm writing about. So, yeah.
Thanks for that. And sort of along similar lines, but also not really. You do have a critique of quite a few critiques of what we might call black nationalism from the various angles that you explore. So, like whether we're talking about the Nation of Islam, the UNIA, and I mentioned before Louise Little, she was actually involved in that one, if I'm not mistaken. The new Black Panthers Party, which is quite different than the Black Panthers Party, and many other names that I'm sure I'm forgetting. And you use the thoughts of the work of someone like Paul Gilroy, for example, to critique those movements and those ideologies. I will just quickly say, like, Paul Gilroy for me was, when I read parts of the Black Atlantic, that was part of a class assignment some years ago, that was, I think, one of the most useful ways that I thought at the time, haven't revisited it that much since, but of thinking about different things. Because so the notion that the very idea that one can belong to a certain heritage across state line, and specifically in his case, obviously the Atlantic, being this place of movement, often forced movement, obviously, is helping me rethink a bit the Mediterranean Sea. And it's still kind of a very, you might say it's on draft mode, but I am starting to think about, I'm trying to think about what does the sea, the Mediterranean Sea specifically, represent these days, given that it's at the same time, if you look at like ancient history or whatnot, it's the place of adventure, the place of trade, the place of what have you, the Odyssey, what have you. Whereas today, it's very much, it's a graveyard. It's quite literally a graveyard of thousands of people died there and drowned to their deaths in the past few years because of the EU's obsession with what I usually call Fortress Europe, thinking of the continent as a fortress to be protected against, and the bodies to be protected against tend to be always black or brown. That being said, how does Paul Gilroy's work, how does it inform your critique of what we're calling black nationalism, and what is it for those who don't know?
Yeah. So I'm really talking about nationalism generally in this text.
Mm-hmm.
And there are different types of nationalism. You have revolutionary black nationalism and you have reactionary black nationalism, with the latter being much more problematic. But I'm actually critiquing nationalism, black nationalism more broadly, uh, and it's I don't maybe it's not even a critique. It's maybe it's like I said, maybe it's more of a warning,
Mm-hmm.
of some of the risks that come with black nationalism. Um, I'm drawing from Gilroy, uh, and his writing in an article called Black Fascism, and sometimes people cling to nationalism in a way that I'm very much trying to work against, because ultimately this version of nationalism that I see a lot of people clinging to, even revolutionary nationalism, is about um, is about working towards uh, the nation state form, and looking for liberation in it or through it. And so I think that that can be let go of, actually. And largely because I see variations of it where it becomes homogenizing and relies on essentialism in a way, in ways that bother me. And I quote Gilroy because he points out the danger in many of these forms with regard to how they take up an essential innocence. And he warns that when you mix biological notions of innocence and inherent goodness with race and nation and ethnic ties, that you run the risk of fascism. And he notes that, you know, those things get even worse when you pair it with the modern nation state, which conditions it and helps expand it. So understanding this raises questions for me about Garvey, about Black nationalisms that drew from him, um, and more, because somebody like Garvey, as complex as he did credit himself at one point with influencing Benito Mussolini. And he was also very apologetic towards white supremacists. And you have to ask questions about why that was and what sort of credit he was giving them and what sort of favor um, uh, he might have done to giving them a sort of legitimacy and some of the various things that he said that were, again, apologetic and uh, and maybe even obviously generous. So this has been a recurring problem for many versions of nationalism. Um, and then there's, obviously issues of hierarchy and belonging and exclusion that I take issue with, tied to the idea of the nation. And so ultimately, I'm pushing back against this idea that just having a Black nation um, is going to be something that frees us and that it brings about liberation, because there's a lot historically, again, that that throws all that into question. And I think that if you are looking at more critical history of Black nationalism and the successes and the failures, that's pretty clear. So I'm not saying anything controversial, but what has to happen is there just has to be a truthful admission that there is a lot of risk and a lot of danger. Um, and it's not just, hey, we just need to do revolutionary Black nationalism and we'll get free.
Hmm. That actually makes me think of the many, many limitations historically, and I mean, this is a critique that I can make today of something like Pan-Arabism, for that matter.
Hmm.
The I'm not gonna get into it too much because I do in like other episodes, but there is an argument to be made that um, for example, in some of the founding mythology of Pan-Arabism, at least after the 40s, after 48 and the establishment of the State of Israel, they viewed their, I'm saying very, very vaguely here, a lot of people disagreed with that, but the general tendency was to see Pan-Arabism as the answer to Zionism. And if not theoretically, but at least in practice, the politics was sort of that, what that ended up doing, and this is something, among other things, again, I'm simplifying a bit, but among other things, one thing that is sort of excluded is the very possibility that one can be Arab and Jewish at the same time. And this is something that ended up actually benefiting the State of Israel, which is ironic from the point of view of Pan-Arabism, because the State of Israel was able to basically say to these, what would end up be calling Mizrahis, so Eastern Jews, as they would be called in Hebrew and in Arabic, so Arabs, some of them would be identified as Arab and Jewish, some of them would say Jews from Arab lands, it's complicated, by saying, well, you're not welcomed over there, quote unquote, in the Arab world, so you should come over here. I'm simplifying, but that's sort of part of the general the general historical trend, and this is something that Pan-Arabism in its I don't know how to say this nicely, but in its ideological rigidity, wasn't able to conceive of plurality, wasn't able to conceive of the fact that one can be, in theory, one could be, for example, Jewish and Arab, one could be Christian and Arab, one could be Muslim and Arab, etc., etc. And many would agree with that, but in practice, it became more and more difficult to do, because there was this tendency to, among other things, and again I'm simplifying, to focus on the hierarchies, to focus on having leaders like Gamal Abdel Nasser, like some of the others, as the center of an ideology. And when that happens, you really end up seeing its fragility, because all that requires one or two military defeats, and then the death of Nasser himself, for the entire project to be put into question and ultimately see its own demise. Because its foundations were very weak in that sense, because they didn't accept a grassroots focus, diversity, pluralism, and so on and so forth. And weirdly enough, although it's kind of an awkward segue, but I wanted to ask, so it's a couple of questions, if that's okay, before we get into the book section. The first one, which is related to how we think about the left and all of the problems that you were talking about, the difference between internationalism, as it's usually understood, and something like intercommunalism. It makes me think, and so I'll ask you to explain that difference. But before that, it made me think of something that Yassin Haj Saleh, who's the Syrian writer, intellectual, and I will have him on soon, hopefully. He was talking about kind of the pitfalls of solidarity. And solidarity from the perspective of a Syrian intellectual, Syrian radical, Syrian activist, what have you, in all of the other categories, we've really seen in the past decade how limiting it's been. And I'm saying limiting to even be nice here. I could say much not nice things, because it's okay if you're a Syrian refugee. Most people on the left would sort of say we need to be pro-refugee, we need to extend the welcoming hand. In London, the chants would be like, say it loud, say it clear, refugees are welcome here, and so on and so forth, which is all fine and well and stuff. Obviously, I agree with that. But what that did not extend to was recognizing that a lot, if not the majority of those refugees were fleeing the Assad regime, were fleeing the state. And that many of those were actually seasoned revolutionaries. They had practical knowledge, they had done things that most of us never had to do, because just we've been luckier, we didn't have to live under the Assad regime or what have you. They had organizational skills that are very valuable, if not just to recognize them, to kind of not strip away their agency, but even from like a purely pragmatic point of view, as someone who supposedly on the left, we have this desire to again, this whole themes that we were talking about, liberation, freedom, what have you, challenge, oppression, etc., etc., then it should follow that we would learn from people who've had different experiences, that they had something to tell us.
Right.
Generally speaking, we can accept them as refugees because then they've been sort of, you use the humanitarian language, which I think is very dehumanizing a lot of the time. But we wouldn't treat them as equal political agents, as people with agency who've done things that we can actually learn from. And so that would be the critique of solidarity as it's usually talked about, that someone like Yassin Haj Saleh would put forward, in which I definitely agree with, and I'll get into it more with him. But that being said, if I understand it correctly, I see something similar, or similar enough. And the difference between something like internationalism and something like intercommunalism, or even like something like charity and something like mutual aid, maybe. And that seems to me, and please feel free to correct or to expand upon, it seems to me that the main difference is how involved do I have to be, or how much do I feel like this is a shared project, a shared political project, a shared communal project, maybe like I have something to give to that person, let's say, but that also that person has something to give to me, if that makes sense. Can you explain the difference, at least in your book, between internationalism and intercommunalism?
Sure, sure. Well, I'm really talking about I'm really talking about intercommunalism as the ideological departure from revolutionary nationalism to an updated outlook that addresses the changing nature of conditions as it relates to nation states and communities of the world. So Huey P. Newton theorized it, and it is often overlooked eh, to a large extent, and likely because it has admissions that contradict his preferred, nationalist historical image with some people. But Newton was talking about the global nature of the ruling class and suggesting that nationalism was increasingly obsolete since the world was becoming more and more of in a state of what he called reactionary intercommunalism. So reactionary intercommunalism is the imperialist siege upon all the communities of the world, dominating the institutions that people have to such an extent that they were not being served by the institutions where they live. So he was pushing for what he called revolutionary intercommunalism, which informed the survival programs of the Panthers. And with regard to the survival programs, you're talking about, the free breakfast program, you're talking about, the free healthcare programs and so on and so forth that they had to meet the needs, material needs of people who were not being, again, served by the institutions around them that are supposed to be serving them from the state. So um, for Huey, revolutionary intercommunalism meant seizing the means of production and redistributing wealth and technology in a way that was egalitarian to communities across the planet. And he was questioning nationhood and nations and states and their existence in the process of re envisioning their ideological position. So the revolutionary and reactionary binary of nationalism is kind of transplanted here to describe conditions and talk about how to achieve a stateless society without it being reactionary. And Huey was pushing against Marxist Leninist doctrine at the time. He said when he gave a speech at Boston College, I want to say, um, where he is talking about this, and he said, people think that they're Marxist Leninists, but they're not creative, and they refuse to be creative. And he said that they were tied to the past. And he said that they're tied to these types of thoughts that are just dogma, which Huey called dogma flunkyism. He called it flunkyism. And he's he was pushing something that was a reconfiguring politic that goes beyond the nation and questions the state and takes up a new look at the world. And so it's a politic that, if nothing else, brings an emphasis on meeting material needs beyond borders into new perspective, and it questions the orthodox in the process. So I think that it, based on the conversation we've had thus far, it's pretty clear why something like that would inform a lot of what I'm saying, as well as it's informed a lot of uh, Black anarchists and Black anarchic politics and autonomous politics, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm. Thanks a lot for that. And this idea that he was saying, the lack of imagination, is actually a good segue to the last question I wanted to ask before getting to the book section, which is I'm very much into stuff like solarpunk, climate fiction, futurisms, indigenous futurism, disability futurism, and Afro-futurism, which is what I wanted to talk to you about. Um, I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on whether it's Afrofuturism specifically or futurism more broadly, and the role that that can have. And so, for those who don't know, I'm talking basically about like speculative. I tend to like to call them speculative movements. It's obviously largely fiction. It's fiction based. It's like stories in the future and so on. But the very first episode of this year was on the political economy of solarpunk with Andrew Dana Hudson, and it was very much about this. You might call it like the non-fiction application of something that's otherwise fictional. Although I tend to like to challenge those two binaries as well, but that's maybe for another time. Um, what do you see the role of futurism and Afrofuturism specifically, and the others, indigenous futurism, disability futurism, and so on, in creating the conditions for more liberation, if that's kind of the way to put it? Like, what's the role between futurism and liberation, if I can put it that way?
Yeah, I don't think I actually really actively use the term
Mm-hmm.
Afrofuturism a lot in any of my work, but I do um, talk about in the text. I do talk about thinking about poetry from the future, drawing from Marx, and really it's pretty simple. I mean, I'm saying that uh, ultimately, if we are going to overcome the problems that we're facing, that we have to stop overemphasizing the past, and
Mm-hmm.
we have to actually think and put more emphasis. And it doesn't have to be an imbalance. I'm just saying more than what currently exists. I'm just saying we need to put more emphasis on thinking about the future than what currently exists in a lot of movements that I feel are stagnant because they are so caught up in the past. And that has a lot to do with my critique of the left. I think that the left is really stuck in the past and seems like it can't escape it in many ways. So for me, I'm actually, I guess maybe even ironically, um, pulling from Marx, who is you know, over represented, I feel like, largely in like the imagination of the left, um, who I feel also gets overemphasized. I'm actually pulling from him to talk about, again, that poetry of the future and what it means to actually imagine a movement and to envision liberation and achieve it and work towards it without being stuck in historical debates and predicaments and problems where people are trapped in these cycles and these binaries again.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree with that, and I find when it comes to solarpunk specifically, that's what I've been most um, engaging with, you might say. I don't write it myself. I'm pretty crap at fiction, but I like to read it. And actually, later today, one of the reasons why we're recording this at this time is that later today I have a class on climate fiction because I'm hoping to, yeah, just get better at it. But in any case, the reason I want to is because I found I have some background in the sciences. I did environmental health as an undergrad, and so I understand the threat of climate change, I would say, very well. And sometimes the fear of that is very paralyzing. Sometimes well, often, it's the kind of what you might call climate anxiety or climate grief, even, is can be very paralyzing, can be very, very, um, uh, what's the word I was thinking of? Heavy, I guess. That's a word I can use. One way that I found to challenge that, to make it more palatable, you might say, is to read these stories, is to kind of get into a space where because most of the time it's just like, something set in 50 years or whatever, and something is happening, and it doesn't deny the ongoing difficulties, even that may still be with us in 50 years or in 100 years or whatever. But the entire idea is that we adopt this optimistic view of things, in the sense of optimist while realist, as one would say, while realistic, in the sense that maybe we did find some solutions. Maybe we did find some ways of restoring the balance between mankind and nature, for example, or what have you. And I mean, those are fictional stories, so you don't read them thinking that this is what's actually going to happen. But just reading about them makes it slightly more real, which helps me, at least, in the day-to-day basis, because otherwise it would just be me reading through the news, and the news is very bad, and reading through the predictions, and they tend to be very bad, and not being able to actually do much about it or think about it, or it's this entire idea of one intellectual called Amitav Ghosh. He called it the unthinkable, like climate change being this unthinkable thing, and my point is to try and make it thinkable, essentially. um, so yeah, that's sort of where I'm coming from it. And Afrofuturism has a similar role, in the sense of thinking about the future as being very different from the present, but and also, um, in order to change the present, we need to be able to have different imaginaries about the future. So it's kind of along the similar lines of what you talked about, I feel.
Right, right.
Um,
It's. I don't mean to cut you off, but
it's okay.
um, yeah, it's directly tied um, what I kind of am constantly talking about when I discuss this text, which is, and when I was just talking about quoting Marx, saying, like, we have to take our poetry from the future, uh, and not just from the past, and strip off the superstition with regard to the past. Um,
Yeah,
it is absolutely important to be able to learn from failure by removing mythology and superstition about what's already taken place. So it's crucial. It's just absolutely crucial.
definitely. All right. Well, before getting into the book session, can you kind of tell folks where they can find you, and tell folks as well about your podcast, the one you co-produce?
Sure, sure. The name of the podcast is Black Autonomy Podcast, and it is with Lorenzo Camboa Irvin and Janina Irvin, and they're just telling their story and talking about Black anarchism and talking about the history, and is really heavily focused on organizing and tactics and strategies. It's for people who just kind of want to hear things explained pretty simply and quickly. It is designed for people who are not necessarily into podcasts. We keep it short and sweet. I think it's a good podcast. I highly recommend people listen to it. And
I highly recommend so as well.
thank you, thank you. And also, people can find me on Twitter at William CSON, William Season. And yeah, they can also check out the work that we're doing at Offshoot Journal. Offshoot Journal is a great publication that we launched me and a couple of other friends launched last. I forget what year it is, but yeah, I think it was last year. We launched it last year, and with that, we have been trying to do some great things. It's a fun project, and we work on it when we can, and it's been going well. And we also have the Soul Street Institute as well, which is tied to Offshoot Journal, where we're highlighting the work and the writings of um, Martin Solstray, who influenced and was one of the founding figures of Black Anarchism. So check that out too. It's all really really fascinating stuff going on. So check out all those things.
Amazing. Thanks for that. All right. So, what are three books that you would recommend to our listeners, and why?
Three books I would recommend to other listeners would be Dionne Brand, A Map to the Door of No Return. That's just a amazing, amazing, amazing book that ask a lot of the questions that I'm bringing up in this text. It was very influential on me writing this text. I read it when I was kind of first starting to start asking a lot of the questions that come up for me, and it just kind of blew me away. I don't even know how to sum it up in a short way, but it's Dionne Brand is an amazing, fascinating, dynamic writer and poet who who does so many things in this book that it just blows your mind. All of the different questions that are raised, all of the different confrontations that are had, the poetry and the prose, just it's all there. So just check out that text. I think it has a lot to offer to many diasporas and many people thinking about belonging, thinking about place, thinking about citizenship, nationalism, and so on. I would also recommend. The Terms of Order by Cedric Robinson. Uh, that that book actually changed a lot for me when I was working on this text as well. It helped me think about anarchism in a critical way, and it also helped me um, think about the left and Western radicalism more largely in in a big way. And it's a text that I feel like um, kind of gets left behind sometimes in favor of Black Marxism, which is the work that most people think about when they think about Robinson. And also check out. There's so many books I want to recommend, but yeah, check out Facing Reality by CLR James and Grace Lee Boggs. And that is CLR again. This is a book that when people think of CLR James, they think of the Black Jacobins or history of Pan African revolt. But CLR James wrote much more than that. And when you read a lot of his other writings, you get a much bigger picture of his politics and the contributions that he had to offer. Um, Facing Reality is a text where he is alongside Grace Lee Boggs. They're pushing against a lot of the problems of state violence and the state form. They're also pushing against Stalinism, and they're pushing against um, sexism and union bureaucracy, and just so many things are happening in that text. And it revolves around the uprising that took place in Hungary. And so, yeah, check that text out too. That is a pretty important text. I think that that people should read.
Well, William, thanks a lot. I don't know how to say it. Thanks a lot for your time. This was fantastic. Yeah, I highly, highly recommend people get your book. Again, it's called The Nation on No Map, Black Anarchism and Abolition. It's by AK Press. And check out everything that William recommended because I'm gonna do the same.
Thanks for having me. This was a fun discussion. The Fire These Times is hosted by myself, Joey Ayoub. I am also its producer, researcher, writer, and sound editor. If you want to help turn this project into a full-time job, please head out to patreon.com/firethesetimes to support it. These episodes are part of a bigger project which includes resources, a newsletter, and eventually YouTube video essays as well. As always, thank you for listening and take care.